So you'll see the first reading comes from the Pentateuch, the Torah, the book of Leviticus, which means laws. It's not a very long reading, and it has to do with the legalness and how the legal ramifications of leprosy were handled in the early Hebrew community. And then that is paralleled in the gospel by Jesus healing a leper. Remember that for the Hebrew people and for the Jews, a ritual purity was required that was connected to temple worship. So when I'm speaking of this reading in the gospel, I want you to put it in that context. There was a ritual purity that was connected to temple worship that defined actions of people among the Hebrew people. Okay, so the Lord said, and notice there's a big gap here. Notice that you start with verses 1 and 2, and look at this, nothing until 44 to 46. Nevertheless, it kind of bookends the point of this. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, if someone has on his skin a scab or pustule or blotch, which appears to be the sore of leprosy, he shall be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of the priests among his descendants. Okay, now I want to talk to you about a couple things. First of all, our English word leprosy refers to Hansen's disease, which now is a disease that can be controlled by antibiotics, and no longer do people have to end up the way like Father Damien on Molokai Island, those people that he worked with who would lose fingers and noses and ears to this disease as it continued on and on. Nowadays, it can be diagnosed and treated with antibiotics. But that's what we mostly think of first when we hear the word leprosy. That is not what the Hebrew people meant by leprosy. And that's why I found this interesting. In one of the translations of the Old Testament, they keep this original Hebrew word, realizing that this really doesn't capture it right. So what this Hebrew word stands for is a group of diseases that are characterized by scaling and peeling. And here's the interesting part. It doesn't just apply to people. It can also apply to walls or clothing. So that's why, and we'd never connect that with this word leprosy. So we need to understand that this is a visible defect, a disfigurement. So it clearly makes exclusion easy because you can see it. You can see what is called in our translation leprosy, but which is really a whole collection of diseases, like I said, that weren't limited to being on humans. So it could be, I'm trying to think. It could be like eczema or psoriasis or something like that. It could even be like that. But it would be something that would be acute. And here's the important thing. The person who suffers from this is brought to the priest because the priest has to decide if this leprosy is active or not. If it is an active case, the person is banned from temple worship. But everything on your skin was not an active case. And only the priest, this is going to come back again in the gospel, only the priest could decide that because it was up to the priest to maintain the ritual temple purity. Okay, you need to understand that before we do anything else. So if the man is leprous and unclean, the priest shall declare him unclean by reason of the sore on his head. Now, it might not be on his head, but that's what this particular piece has. Remember, they're patching together. Look at this. They're patching together from the beginning and the end of the whole chapter. So this does not refer to only things on the head. It refers to a whole group of diseases that were defects and disfigurements and blemishes, which is why they could also be on walls and clothes as well as on the skin, on human skin. Okay, now the next part goes to the very end of the chapter 13 in Leviticus. And this says how you have to act according to the priest. The one who bears it should say active sore of leprosy shall keep his garments. This is important that you look at what I've highlighted. Shall keep his garments rent, his head bare, so the hair would be flowing, shall muffle his beard. Oddly enough, given where we are now, it was a cover on the beard, just like a face mask. The man wouldn't just cover his beard, but obviously his mouth as well. He shall cry out, unclean, unclean. As long as the sore is on him, he shall declare himself unclean, since he is in fact unclean. He shall dwell apart, making his abode outside the camp. Now here's why I wanted you to note all these things that I highlighted. All of these things, with the exception of this crying out that you're unclean and not being able to live in the community, these are all actions of grief associated with death. When you found out someone you died, the ritual was to rend or rip your outer garment. You would not have a head covering and your hair would just flow loose. You'd cover up, that's what muffle means, cover up your mouth. And that's how you would ritualize the grief of death. So the fact that leprosy is connected with the grief of death is because of these two last things that I highlighted. It is equivalent to death because it kept you apart, and that is the grief of death. In fact, in an Orthodox Jewish household, when you sit Shiva for 7 days after someone in the household has died, you cover up the mirrors and all of this ritual goes around, and people come to you, bring you food, sit with you in silence, all of that sitting Shiva is. But at the end of that week, everything that I just said is like giving shape to the grief. But at the end of that, family members come and take the family outside and walk them around the block into the light of life again. And then when they return to the house, the mirrors are uncovered, everything's back to normal again. So there was a definite ritual to it. And here, the reason that leprosy is kin to death is because you have to keep saying, I'm unclean, and live apart. You have to be all covered up, let people know when you approach. Now, you have to realize this came from, certainly now we can realize this came from the Hebrew law because there was a need to protect the community from infections that could get uncontrollable. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? And especially there was a need for that, given that there was no medicine to counteract any of it. Clearly no antibiotics, certainly no vaccines, nothing like that. So there was definitely a need for that is going to spill over into the first century when Jesus is in fact around. And as I said before, exclusion was easy because it was visible. Like you can sit and talk to somebody and not realize that the person has epilepsy or cancer or, lots of things, but the leprosy could not be hidden. And the death part of it for the victim was the fact that they were cut from the community and had to, this right here, crying out unclean, unclean, like if they approached for alms, if they would approach from where they lived outside the city, usually among the tombs, the caves that were used as tombs, and they'd come in to beg for alms so that they could eat, and they'd have to keep calling out as they were all covered up, unclean, 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 thereby pushing people away from them. Do you see how this was like death for the people who were in fact the lepers? They couldn't live with anybody else. And even when they were physically close to somebody, they had to cry out words that would make people go farther away. And those two things down here explain why these three things were done. Because in Jewish culture, this is how you ritualize death. And to these people, this disease was death. Now, I shouldn't say, when I say disease, you might think of Hansen's disease. I'm speaking in the terms that the Hebrews thought of it, which could be any kind of a visible defect, which would be temporary, understand. Now, the leper, the real lepers, it wouldn't be temporary. But for a lot of people who suffered something temporary, temporary disfigurement or defilement on their skin or something, then their disconnection with the community would be ended when they came back and showed the priest and said, look, I'm okay now. And then he would welcome the person back to temple worship. Now that's really the setup for the gospel story, so that you understand a little bit of the background or the context out from which Jesus is going to be operating here. Okay, so here is the gospel. First of all, I need to say that Mark's approach, which we've talked about before, which is very concise and terse and right to the point, he doesn't waste words. I think the advantage of that is that we can get into the story with our imaginations. And in that way, if this makes sense to you, you can almost get a texture of the story. Like, that is the word I want to use, but Mark's language helps us to feel it, so to speak. And I think that's a big gift of Mark's gospel to us. He's very to the point, but to me, that point is like an inroad, inviting our imaginations to do something with the story, and literally to just kind of use our senses to enter into the story. So hearing, and if there were any smelling, if you can use your, that's a very classic Jesuit way to approach gospel pericope. Sit with it through your senses. Close your eyes. What do you smell? Are they in the marketplace? Do you smell the food that's being sold? What do you see? What do you hear? Is it loud because people are all around? Do you know what I mean? That's what I mean by texture. And I think Mark's gospel is one that it very incisively invites us to feel the texture of the story. And actually then when you do that, it can become more sacramental in the sense of opening us up to the greater truth in it. Okay, this follows a pattern that is typical to all these miracle stories. First, there's a naming of the disease, leper. Then there's a cure. Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. And then there's a demonstration or something that has to be shown to someone. In this case, the leper being sent to the high priest so that he could be welcomed back into the temple worship. Okay, so that's a typical, that 3-point thing is very typical of miracle stories. That's why you might remember healing of Simon's mother-in-law was a little different because the name of her illness wasn't specified, which in Mark would be unusual. Okay, now the third point of what I said, going to the priest to demonstrate that the cure had indeed happened and the man could be returned to temple worship, had a caveat with it. Jesus said, right here, see that you tell no one anything. And that's summarily dismissed. The man went away and began to publicize the whole matter. And that is often the case in Mark's gospel. There is this, there's this stylized element in Mark's gospel that's called the messianic secret. So Jesus will tell someone something or do something to someone like a cure, a healing, and say, shh, don't tell anybody. And then that's ignored because the person doesn't ever listen to what Jesus is asking. So at first blush, you can say, well, gosh, what the heck? If Jesus cured me, I'd do everything he said, you know, but that isn't the sense here. Remember, this isn't historical, it's theological. Mark is trying to make a theological point. So when he has Jesus say right here, see that you tell no one anything, Mark's point is, who I am is only going to be rightly understood in the light of the cross. And if you reduce who I am to miracles, you will miss the whole point. So Jesus is in effect saying what I just said by saying, okay, don't say anything, just go to the priest and then get back to the temple when when it's time to go to the temple. And then this man ignoring it is Mark's way to theologically say, even though Jesus did not want to be prematurely exposed as the Messiah before the Paschal mystery, before the death and resurrection and ascension, somehow you can't contain that because that's how big that is. And so these two last stanzas of this gospel pericope really are a theological statement from Mark. And remember that as we move through Mark and hear more about Jesus saying, shh, don't say anything to anybody. And then, of course, the person ignores Jesus. But remember what's really happening. Mark is making a theological statement. Mark knew Jesus did not want to be perceived as just a miracle worker or a wonder worker. That is not the kind of Messiah he was. If he were that kind of Messiah, he could have just very dramatically gotten himself off the cross. But he wasn't. Jesus was Messiah and stayed on the cross to die because his messiahship was expressed in a spectacular act of the heart, where he surrendered to death and forgave the people who did it. Mm-hmm. That's the messiahship of Jesus. And healing people and curing people helped him get that message across, but he never wanted to be reduced to the miracle worker. And Mark theologically is making that point by having Jesus say, okay, you're cured, don't tell anybody, and then the person tells somebody. That's going to happen all the way through the Gospel of Mark. Okay, now up here, moved with pity. This is also translated in some texts as moved with anger. This is the Greek word, splankthenistis. And here and what we'll hear Sunday is translated with compassion. But the reason it's sometimes translated as anger is because scripture scholars believe this whole pericope here is really a joining of two separate accounts of Jesus healing somebody. One with more emotion and anger, and one with pity. And so that's why this Greek word, which occurs in the original canon, is translated two different ways. Now, it's interesting that, or it helps us, I think, to use our imaginations, that we're going to hear the translation of compassion or pity, as we're going to hear, moved with pity. Because it would make sense, wouldn't it, that if you'd see somebody who was relegated to the life of a leper, that you'd feel pity for that person. But what if, and here's the stretch of it, more than just Jesus stretching out his hand, here's the imaginative stretch. You can imagine that Jesus' pity and compassion and emotion resulted from the sadness that the man would ever not, that Jesus would ever not want to cure him. Because notice this dependent clause. If you wish, you can do it. And right away, Mark says, Jesus is moved with pity, with compassion. Could that not be a sadness, not at the man's being relegated to the life of a leper, but to doubting that Jesus would want healing for this person? And that would be the source of Jesus' sadness and pity and compassion. Right here. Touching him, that is the greatest thing of import that happens in this pericope. And again, you have to understand, try to understand the perception of this in the first century. It wasn't so much that, if we don't consider leprosy, if we consider, so I'm going to say, if we don't consider Hansen's disease, but we consider all the aggregate of skin conditions that the Hebrew people used the name leprosy for. So it isn't so much they're all contagious. True leprosy was, especially in those days, right? But this aggregate of skin conditions wasn't all catchy. So it isn't that the prohibition was don't touch that, you're going to catch something. It was that it was dirty, ritually dirty. It's not infectious, it's ritually polluting. There's a difference there. Can you hear it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's very important, because as I said when I began the Leviticus reading, this idea, and the priests were the guardians of this. The priests had to guard this ritual purity that came connected with the idea of holiness from the presence of God in the temple. Be holy as the Lord your God is holy. So you'd want to have a wholeness that would reflect the holiness. And if you had these conditions, that would take away from the integrity, the wholeness of you, which then couldn't represent holiness to God. Now, could you follow that? Because that's I know that's convoluted, but that's really important that you get. Because this isn't a catchy, infectious thing. It's a dirty, polluting thing in the sense of temple ritualistic purity. Mm-hmm. So why would Jesus do this? I don't think Jesus is telling us to set aside all medical hygiene. What I think is the point here, Jesus touches the leper to show us what God does. Jesus touches the leper to show us what God does. And look at what he says. I do will it. That goes back up to here. If you wish, if you want to, God, Jesus, if you want to, Jesus, you can make me clean. I do want to. Look at this short sentence. Be made clean. That's called the divine passive in Scripture, because it doesn't have a subject. It's just pure power. Be made clean. And that is so direct and honest and to the point. That's how God reveals God's self, directly, honestly, to the point. This right here, this is hugely impactful in this little pericope. So Jesus references the man's question up here, and then he just says very simply, be made clean. That's the divine passive or theological passive. God is the one who does this. And this part here, most scripture scholars think dismissing him means the disease, the demon that was responsible for this disease. Because after this sentence, then Jesus talks to the man, tells him not to say anything to anybody. So most people think that Jesus is dismissing the cause of this leprosy, whatever it is. Notice too that in doing this, when he says, go show yourself to the priest down here, Jesus is taking on the role of the Old Testament Hebrew priest by naming the man cured and then saying, but we're going to go along with what the rule is here. You go and show yourself to the temple priest so you can go back to worshiping again. But Jesus is appropriating the role of priest in this particular pericope. Now, what do we take from this? There are a couple of things to take that are all, I think, very opening up to what we can do with this gospel inside of ourselves. So, first of all, this man had to acknowledge he was a leper, right? So he had to do all the things that we read about in this reading. He had to have rent garments, bare head, covered up beard, cry out unclean, unclean, living outside the town. He had to do all of that. Okay, so clearly he couldn't hide who he was or what he had. And he approached Jesus with the truth of who he was. Now, this kind of goes back to what we talked about with Job last week. A paradox of our faith is that we are asked, we're required, I think, to have a frame of mind that we're least comfortable with, an acceptance of our disabilities, an acceptance of who and what we're not. A lot of us might have an image of, one day I'm just going to present myself pure and holy and whole to God. And that's a delusion, because the subject of that sentence was I. Mm-hmm. We have to know that the whole point of redemption is to reach down and bring us to the heart of God, not because of anything we do or say or are, but because of the pure, merciful love that God is. So if we don't learn to get more comfortable with the unwhole people that we are, we're going to miss the whole gift of redemption. That's one takeaway of this, I think. Another takeaway of this is this last sentence. Jesus remained outside in deserted places, and people kept coming to him from everywhere. Do you see the irony in this? The leper gets to go back to town and live there, and he gets to go back to the temple for worship and continue to do that. And Jesus stays in the places where people are not welcome. So this miracle puts Jesus geographically in a new place. And because Jesus is in a new geography, it says something to us who look to Jesus for something about faith and life in a divine and spiritual way. There is a huge truth in the margins and people who inhabit the margins. And if we never recognize that, then we're missing another whole piece of God's redemptive love. It's so much bigger than we. Some people get so convinced of this that they make pilgrimages to places where people live in the margins. And I use that word pilgrimage because they go with the specific intent of opening themselves to the holy that is there. That pilgrimage where you walk across Spain to St. James of Compostela, and you walk along and stay in hostels, you walk as a pilgrim. It takes long time. That's the whole point. The point is I'm walking, not traveling in a car. I'm walking, just carrying something on my back so that I can change clothes in these hostels and live very simply, talk to people I meet on the way. It's totally not what I am. But the point is that I will be open in this moving to the margins of my life, because I don't live like that. I want to open myself to this inrush of the divine, which is never only in certain places, even though it's often protected only in certain places. Third takeaway. For the leper, his insight into Jesus and his healing happened at the same time. In our lives, they can be separated by sometimes a lifetime. Our insight into who Jesus is, who God is for us, and the healing that we need doesn't often happen as we wish it would, as soon as we wish it would. But the point is, never doubt that God intends to heal, redeem, pull you to God's heart with merciful and compassionate love. Don't make it contingent on a time increment. Even though in this particular pericope, the leper experienced both at the same time. And finally, even though lepers had to live outside of the city because of the contagion, and there are, as there are today, right, because of the pandemic, situations in which we have to stay apart. Even in those circumstances, the movement of Jesus' kingdom is that even though we might have to accept such geographical divisions temporarily, that is always mourned, and we want to move to the time when those divisions will be erased. We will never be the kingdom until we are completely united with one another. So for Jesus, it's never a matter just of healing, removing the disease. Jesus wants to remove the barrier, because what happens to us? We can turn barriers into prejudices. The Gospels warn us constantly about setting up barriers too casually, because they can lock into something inside us which keep us apart. And that's never the trajectory of the gospel. That's why Jesus was so concerned with healing and bringing people together, because communion is the point, always.